In the last two installments, we discussed the centralization of power that was taking place in Western Europe under the likes of the new monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. And we also mentioned a shout out to Charles the Sixth and Louis the XI in France. We talked about issues that the nobility in Western Europe had with this process and their attempts to stand up to the ever growing power of the monarchs, which, as we said, came at the expense of the nobility. In Spain, they had to deal with the Catalonian revolt. In France, they dealt with the Fronde, two Frondes. And in England, we haven't really gone into this yet, but England experienced a civil war under Charles I. So all of those are, again, a backlash about the growing power and influence of a centralized monarch. We also pointed out that in Eastern Europe, the centralization process didn't take hold, and the nobility remained basically in power, maintained their power in places like Poland because of disastrous policies like the Liberum Veto. Thus, Eastern Europe remained economically and politically backward until the 20th century. In today's installment, we'll further our understanding of the impact of this centralization and the impact that it had on religion in various states. One of the best examples of monarchs reforming religion to greater control for their country and its morals, trying to control their country and its morals, was Henry VIII of England. Now, I'd be doing a disservice to you if I didn't fill in the blanks of how Henry VIII emerged to stardom in England, so here it goes. After the 100 Years' War, England dealt with a power struggle between two competing families that resulted in a civil war that we know of as the War of the Roses. This war lasted approximately from 1455 to 1477. The House of York fought the House of Lancaster to gain the crown. The House of York was victorious, and this gave rise to the Tudor dynasty, which would rule England until 1603 upon the death of Elizabeth I. The first ruler of this dynasty was Henry VII. He possessed traits of the new monarchs we discussed previously, like Ferdinand and Isabella and Louis XI in France. He began the process of centralizing his authority and taking away the threat of other nobles from taking his power. He implemented something called the Star Chamber Court. You need to know this. The Star Chamber was a tribunal-style court in which he used unfair methods similar to the Spanish Inquisition to round up the nobility or round up nobles who posed a threat to his power and to his Tudor dynasty. It consisted of trials without juries, and he also dished out severe punishments, including torture. Henry VII also made it illegal for the nobility to keep private armies under their own insignias. So he basically mandated loyalty and submission to his power. This is the world that Henry VIII entered into as he took the crown in 1509. It's important to note that this struggle over power in England continued. English Parliament actually gained a little bit of momentum in this struggle against the crown. In fact, standard governmental procedures were set in place where the king had to call upon Parliament, especially on issues of revenue and taxation. Again, you probably learned that in Mr. Klein's class last year, and of course, the infamous Magna Carta in 1215. So they were still dealing with that legacy. Thus, in comparison, when you look at England and comparing that with France and Spain, England and the Tudor monarchs didn't have as much power over taxation. Where Henry will make his mark or legacy is what the title of this presentation is. He's going to make his mark in the realm of religion. And in 1534, Henry VIII, King of England, joined the Protestant movement and started his own church by breaking away from the Catholic Church. This was pretty ironic at the time because initially, as the Protestant Reformation broke out with Martin Luther in 1517, he actually condemned Luther's theology and actually wrote books that drew praise from the Pope. He actually called his book In Defense of the Seven Sacraments, blasting Luther and a lot of the Protestant divisions, branches of Protestantism, for only having two sacraments. And the Pope bestowed a title upon him, Henry VIII, the defender of the faith. But this loyalty later went tested for very different reasons than the other Protestant reformers and why they broke away. He created the Church of England, which established him as king, as the head of church, not the Pope. Again, the Church of England created, or the Anglican Church, made the king, Henry VIII, the head of the church, not the Pope. His ambitions to form a unique Protestant church were not like Luther or Calvin, who actually did it for theological reasons, opposing Catholic views and doctrine. It was basically so Henry get a divorce. You see, Henry sought an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she could not bear a son. They did have a daughter, Mary, but they had trouble having kids that survived childbirth. Having a son was necessary for him to preserve the strength of the Tudor dynasty. Mary was betrothed to the Dauphin of France. If she inherited the throne from Henry, England would become subject to French control. Henry didn't want this. Henry believed that God was punishing him for having married his brother's widow, a passage he referred to in the book of Leviticus in the Bible. You're confused right now. Yeah, Henry's older brother, Arthur, was married to Catherine of Aragon, and Arthur died. Henry became king. He kind of had the hots for Catherine, and he married her. He had earlier received papal dispensation allowing him to marry Catherine because it was kind of shady, the fact that she was married to, you know, her his brother. So it was kind of weird that, he had got special privilege by the Pope to marry Catherine. Now he seeks an annulment and wants a divorce. This was also controversial because Catherine was Spanish and Philip II was her nephew. Philip, as we know, was probably the most devout Catholic ruler in the history of rulers, and the Pope didn't want to embarrass him, so he said no to the annulment. He was also enamored with his mistress, Anne Boleyn. It's getting kind of racy here, a little dicey. So Cardinal Thomas Cranmer convinced Henry in 1533 that, hey, you want a divorce? You can have it. Just break away from the church in Rome. And Henry and Anne secretly married in 1533. She happened to be already 6 months pregnant with future Queen Elizabeth. Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and formed the Church of England. This act is known as the Act of Supremacy in 1534. And again, as I reiterated a comment that I made earlier, it made the king officially the head of the Church of England. Catholic lands, about 25% of all land in England, were confiscated. This doubled royal revenues, which helped build up Henry's military. Henry sold many of these properties for revenue and bribed people to support his Catholic treason with land. We've already discussed that as well. Henry's ambitions to form a unique Protestant church, as we said, are different from Luther and Calvin. He basically, to summarize it, did it so he could get a divorce. So, as such, Henry really didn't care about the theological issues of the day and differences Luther and Calvin had been infatuated with in opposing Catholicism. So while the Anglican Church or the Church of England it is considered Protestant, it operated very similarly to the Catholic Church, with the king at the head and not the Pope. The services were almost identical. Now, a couple things. The Act of Succession. All of the king's subjects had to take an oath of loyalty to the king as the head of the Anglican Church. This was in 1534, and it coincided with the Act of Supremacy. This also made Anne Boleyn's children legitimate heirs to the English throne. So Henry ordered the execution of Sir Thomas More, his former mentor, for refusing to take the oath. Here, Sir Thomas More, the author of Utopia, and as we called him, a Christian humanist, still, even though he wanted reform, he was not about to break away from the Catholic Church, or at least support it. So he was executed. In total, Henry had 6 wives during his reign. Anne Boleyn was executed eventually in 1536, ostensibly for having had an affair. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, had a son, Edward, who succeeded Henry upon his death in 1547. Another thing that we need to write down, possibly for the AP exam, is in 1539, he issued a statute of the 6 Articles, otherwise known as the 6 Articles of Faith. The Anglican Church maintained most of the Catholic doctrines. Examples: 7 sacraments, they kept it. Celibacy for the clergy, they kept it. And also transubstantiation, despite its independence from Rome. So again, 6 Articles of Faith basically make the Anglican Church like the Catholic Church. The only difference is the king is at the head of the church, not the Pope. So, before we get to the next great tutor, I feel it necessary to fill in the blanks of what happened between Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth's reign. Henry and Elizabeth are the leaders most likely to be on the AP exam from the Tudor dynasty. But Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, as we said earlier, had a son, Edward, who succeeded Henry upon his death in 1547. Now, Edward VI reigned from 1547 to 1553. He was 10 years old when he became king. Those who governed on his behalf were strongly Protestant. He had regents. Regents are actors, acting leaders, until a young king or young queen can actually assume the reins of control of a country. And during Edward VI's reign, England moved towards Protestantism more so than under Henry, and basically adopted more Calvinist style religious policies. New practices that were implemented under Edward VI, the clergy can marry, iconic images were removed from churches, communion by the laity was expanded, and salvation by faith alone was implemented. They denied transubstantiation, and they only kept two sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist or communion. Again, you don't need to know all of this. I'm just going through changes that were made under Edward VI because it's going to make things interesting for Mary and for Elizabeth coming at the edge of Edward's premature death. Edward did die in 1553, and this leads to a religious struggle among Protestants and Catholics within England. Enter Mary Tudor, who ruled from 1553 to 1558. She tried unsuccessfully to reimpose Catholicism. Now, again, she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and she was the daughter of Henry VIII, and she had earlier married Philip II, the future heir to the Spanish throne. So this makes her ultra Catholic. She grew up Catholic, and when she takes over, she wants to make Philip. She wants to make Philip happy, and so she rescinds a lot of the Reformation legislation of Henry's and Edward's reign. So what does she do? She starts to persecute people. This is why she's called Bloody Mary. 300 people were executed, including bishops and Archbishop Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who were her opponents with the Anglican Church. So they called her Bloody Mary. Some people fled. Protestants fled England fearing persecutions. They're known as Marian exiles. A lot of them will go to the Netherlands and Holland. So lastly, I want to leave you before we get into Elizabeth with a painting. This painting shows what life was like under the brief rule of young Edward VI. At the center of the portrait is King Edward VI, with his dying father, Henry VIII, in bed to the left. The composition reveals the difficulties faced by the rule of a minor during these turbulent times. The dying king, extending his right arm, transmits his blessing to rule, but the portrait includes many others with the father and son. On the right is the full Privy Council, which is to manage England during the boy's youth. Seated next to Edward is his uncle, Edward Seymour, who served as the first Lord Protector of England while Edward was young. Seymour's successor, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, is seated next to him. During Edward's brief 6-year rule, both dukes would try to usurp power from Edward VI, and beneath the young kin, the Pope and monks are crushed by Scripture. While outside the window, iconoclastic Protestants destroy churches and images. During the regency of the young king, Catholicism came under attack in England. But many of those policies, again, as I mentioned, would be reversed under his Catholic sister, Mary. As I said, Edward died young. He died at the age of 16 without an heir. So it passed to Bloody Mary. So there ends the first installment of Monarchs and Religion during the centralization process. And we'll pick up in the next presentation, and we're going to talk about the most famous Tudor. And of course, I'm talking about Elizabeth I. Thanks for tuning in.